chegou o grande momento e eu gostaria de pedir licença para fazer a próxima apresentação em inglês. Cidadão Global Forum aims to start a dialogue on the responsibility of the global citizen in building a better future. In a time of extraordinary change and uncertainty, with so many frustration coming out from the polls around the world, a growing chorus of political, business, and NGO leaders are calling upon citizens to stand up and come together to build the future they seek. Perhaps no other global leader translates the spirit of the changes of our time as President Obama. Few presidents have walked a more improbable path to the White House. Born in Hawaii to a mother from Kansas and a father from Kenya, Obama was raised with help from his grandparents. The homespun values they instilled in him, paired with his innate sense of optimism, compelled Obama to devote his life to giving every child the same chance America gave him. He took office at a moment of crisis unlike any America had seen in decades. A nation at war, a planet in peril, the American dream itself threatened by the worst economic calamity since the Great Depression. And yet, despite all manner of political obstruction, Obama's leadership helped rescue the economy, revitalize the American auto industry, reform the healthcare system to cover another 20 million Americans, and put the country on a firm course to a clean energy future, all while overseeing the longest stretch of job creation in American history. On the world stage, Obama's belief in America's indispensable leadership and strong, principled diplomacy helped win down the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, decimate al-Qaeda and eliminate the world's most wanted terrorists, shut down Iran's nuclear weapons program, open a new chapter with the people of Cuba, and unite humanity in coordinated action to combat a changing climate. In times of great challenge and change, President Obama's leadership ushered in a strong economy, a more equal society, a nation more secure at home, and more respected around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama.
Thank you. Bom dia, Brazil. Thank you so much. Well, I want to thank everyone at Grupo Globo and Santander for inviting me. Jose Roberto Marino, João Roberto Marino, Frederick, thank you so much for the introduction. Sergio Real and Marcos Maduriera. And I want to thank all of you for having me here today. I'm thrilled to be back in Brazil. It has been a while since I was here, and I've been eager to return ever since. This country showed me some of your legendary hospitality when we visited in 2011. Muito obrigado. I had the chance to visit the City of God. Michelle and I took our girls to see Christ the Redeemer. And although I did not get a chance to attend the World Cup, Joe Biden took that ticket. And I didn't get a chance to attend the Olympics. I still have not been to Carnaval. Nevertheless, I am thrilled to be here today. You know, Brazil was the first country that I visited in South America as president, which wasn't a coincidence. As Americans, we recognize Brazil's extraordinary rise, and we have consistently rooted for your success. And I believe that as the hemisphere's two largest democracies and two largest economies, we have a unique responsibility and opportunity to match the unrelenting pace of globalization and technological change, to meet challenges like economic inequality and terrorism, and to shape the future of this region, but also shape the future of the world. These are challenging times, and Frederick and I will have a chance to have a dialogue about this, but before I answer questions, let me just point out some of the key challenges that we all face. In some ways, it is the best of times and the worst of times. The world is more prosperous than ever before, but that's come with industrial disruptions, wage stagnation across many advanced economies, and has left too many workers and too many communities believing that the prospects for themselves and for their children will be worse rather than better in the future. The world is more connected than ever before. But even as the internet has the potential to spread knowledge and opportunity, it also empowers those who spread hatred and death. And in Brazil, in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere, we see the internet contributing to the splintering of our politics, the tribalization of our politics. In this age of instant information, where Twitter can feed us a steady stream of bad news, it's natural that people are seeking some sense of certainty and control over their lives. Where you see cultures colliding, you see people worried about whether their traditional values and ideas and roots are being torn apart. And so it's inevitable that our politics and our social arrangements are getting disrupted at the same time that all these technological disruptions are taking place. And the question that we all face, whether in Brazil, whether in the United States, in Asia, or in Africa, the question is whether, for the sake of our individual families and our collective politics, do we have the capacity to rebuild and renew social and political arrangements so that change works for everybody and not just some? Can we make sure that these new wonders, like the internet, or services on demand, or driverless cars, or drone deliveries, can we make sure that those help the economy for all people and not just those at the very top? Can we prove that in a shrinking world, a turn to nationalism or xenophobia or the populist politics of a very far right or left, the us versus them politics, can we persuade people that that would take us backwards, that that's not the right direction, that instead we need more than ever to embrace the values of pluralism and tolerance and diversity and rule of law in order for us to move forward? Can we remake our politics in a way that inspires people to reach across our divides of race and religion and ethnicity so that we can find that common thread of humanity and replace fear with hope? Now, one of the advantages of no longer running for office is I don't have to offer a 10-point plan for how to solve all these problems. But I do have just a few ideas that I think need to be focused on. Number one, we have to make sure that this new economy works for all nations and all peoples. You know, I believe that capitalism and open markets are the greatest wealth generators in human history, and they've done a remarkable job of raising standards of living around the world, of spurring innovation, of increasing productivity. But what is also true is that globalization, automation, all those things that have given us such amazing benefits have weakened the position of workers to secure fair wages. in many cases have disrupted old industries that were rooted in communities, and those communities have not recovered. And in a world where just 1% controls as much wealth as everyone else, we will not see political stability. Not only that, but if you look at economic history, economies don't grow as quickly and as successfully when too much wealth is concentrated at the top at the expense of a broad and growing middle class. Society doesn't work as well when people feel as if the economic game is fixed, so that just insiders are benefiting, rather than it being open to competition for anyone who has a good idea or is willing to work hard. And so some of the trends that we're seeing in the United States, across advanced economies, as well as around the world, that's a recipe for cynicism and polarization and a breakdown in trust in our institutions. And that's in part what spurs unworkable reactions and proposals, like protectionism, trying to wall off ourselves from competition from elsewhere. So going forward, in each country, we've got to build new social compacts that give all of our young people the education that they need, that give workers the power to organize for better wages, that ensure a tax system that is fair and that doesn't allow those who've benefited from this new economy to avoid their obligations, but rather leads them to reinvest in their country and give other people and other businesses a chance. We've got to invest in our people, their skills, their education, their capacity to take an idea and turn it into a business. In what is going to be an increasingly service-based economy, we have to modernize our safety nets, because that not only creates political stability, it also empowers people to take risks. If they know that if things don't work out completely, that at least they'll have a baseline, a floor that they won't sink beneath. And just as we work to reduce inequality in each of our own countries, we have to work to close the gap between rich and poor nations. So helping emerging economies become markets for American goods or Brazilian goods, keeping fragile states from collapsing by ensuring that young populations see a brighter future. That's not just charity, that's not just the right thing to do, it is also the smart thing to do. And that brings me to my second point. Most of our biggest challenges require international cooperation. Take the threat of climate change. We've just seen a very devastating hurricane season. And we can never attribute a particular hurricane to climate change, but what we do know is that the trend lines indicate stronger hurricanes, longer wildfire seasons, more drought, more flooding. These are not accidents. They are our future if temperatures around the globe continue to rise. That's science. Now, the good news is that in the United States, for example, during my administration, we proved that economic progress and environmental protection are not in conflict, but in fact can complement each other. So while I was president, for example, we increased wind power by 3-fold and solar power by 10-fold, and those industries now create far more jobs than the old coal industry did. But each country is not going to be able to solve these problems just by themselves. The United States can't solve the problem without Brazil. Brazil can't solve the problem without China. China cannot solve the problem without India or other developing nations. So we're going to have to work in concert to lower carbon emissions enough to buy the time that's going to be needed for some of the key scientific and energy breakthroughs that will solve this problem once and for all. And what gives me hope is that Latin America is dramatically ramping up its renewable energy use. In many ways, Brazil's leading the way. The work in biofuels here has been an example for the entire world, and that is something that you should be proud of and continue to build on. Third point, we need to recognize that on the world stage, our biggest threat is not the old great power contests of the past, but oftentimes failed states or rogue states or networks of terrorism or disaffection among young populations that have no opportunity. And what that means is that we can't just solve problems with tanks and aircraft. I'm very proud that the United States has the most powerful military in the world, and that's necessary in some cases to keep the peace. North Korea, for example, poses a real danger. And that's why, in addition to maintaining our military and technological edge, we have to also maintain strong alliances around the world. But in order to do that, we have to understand that our safety and security doesn't just depend on military hardware, it depends on strong diplomacy and nurturing our alliances and encouraging cooperation between nations. The power of our economies, the power of our ideals are just as important in assuring peace, not just extraordinary military power. So we have to make sure that we understand that that's how we can create the kinds of landscape of hope rather than the circles of fear and despair that we see growing in so many regions of the world. And fourth, we need a renewed sense of openness to people of different cultures and who look differently than us. One of the things that the United States and Brazil shares is a multiracial history. Sometimes it's been a painful history. And my hope is that here in Brazil, as my hope is in the United States, we see that as a source of strength and not a source of weakness. That the possibilities of people from different backgrounds and different experiences all contributing to moving a nation forward, that's the future. That includes, by the way, being open to immigrants. In the United States, immigrants start about 30% of all new businesses. Now, how immigration takes place makes a difference. It has to be orderly. There are going to be some tensions when immigrants move into a country. Immigrants can sometimes compete for service and construction jobs in the United States, for example. So we have to be careful about uncontrollable floods of immigration that will lead to a political backlash and that puts at risk our ability to welcome immigrants entirely. But we have to recognize that in this new age, when everybody's connected, we should welcome the continuing influx of new ideas and economic dynamism that an orderly immigration process brings. And we should continue to be open to dealing with refugees from countries that have been devastated by war, in part because many of our own families here in Brazil or in the United States came to these countries in part because they were fleeing places that were oppressing them. We can't forget that. And my last point, we're going to have to recognize how technology changes the way people consume information and recognize that what we thought was all for the good can also sometimes lead to damaging and divisive trends in our countries. You know, we're more connected than ever, but it makes us, in some ways, it makes it easier for us to retreat into our own tribes, our own bubbles, where we only listen to people who think like we do. And we never challenge our own assumptions, because everything we read, everything we see, is simply what an algorithm has told us we should see. And we become so secure in our beliefs that we tend to screen out information that doesn't fit our opinions, rather than base our opinions on the facts and evidence and reason that are there. And that means that we're going to have to find new ways to cultivate independent journalism, and there's a strong tradition of independent journalism here in Brazil, as there is in the United States. We have to push back at new forms of propaganda that are being turbocharged by the digital landscape. And we have to work to listen to people with whom we disagree, so that we can bridge our differences and find common ground and the compromise that democracy requires. Now, this is hard to do. In the United States, our politics is not bridging a lot of differences right now. There are some structural reasons that are unique to our country for this. The corrosive influence of money in our politics is a real problem. Entrenched partisanship that is encouraged by the way that maps are drawn for purposes of voting. The United States has remarkably low voting rates for such an advanced democracy, in part because there are laws in place that make voting harder rather than easier, and that is a carryover from the days in which people who looked like me were not supposed to vote. And so in the United States, if these flaws in our democracy aren't addressed, and if our citizens start believing they have no control over the decisions that are made in a distant Washington, then it's not surprising that over time you will see populist movements or nationalist movements or potentially even authoritarian movements making progress and threatening some of our long-term traditions. Brazil has its own unique problems, but those dangers exist here as well. And so one of the things that I continually want to point out to audiences is that democracy, I believe, is the best form of government that's ever been devised by man, but it is hard. It requires work. It requires the investment of each of us as citizens in the process. It requires us to be informed. It requires us to participate. And in fact, progress is fragile. It doesn't move in a straight line. We can't guarantee that the United States will always get better if we don't make it better. Just as Brazil can't be assured that your democracy is here to stay if you are not invested in continually making it work. The good news is, I don't believe that the future favors the strong man. I don't believe that the future favors autocrats. I deeply believe that the liberal international order that is based not on military power alone or tribal affiliations, but based on principles like rule of law and human rights and individual freedom, that is the future. That is what has brought us this far. That's what's promoted so much opportunity around the world. That's what's prevented another great world war. That's what's lifted billions of people out of extreme poverty around the globe. So those of us who believe in democracy have to speak out forcefully, because the facts and history are on our side. That doesn't mean that our democracies are not without flaws. We have to recognize those flaws and work to solve them. But it means that the cure for what ails democracy is greater engagement by citizens rather than a withdrawal from the public space. And so that's why, for the rest of my career, I'll be focusing my career on getting people involved in how they are governed, active citizenship. I'm going to spend most of my time not just working on particular issues, but doing everything I can do to help train and prepare the next generation of young people to take leadership. Because when you meet young people around the world, whether in the United States or Brazil or anywhere else that I travel, they will inspire you. They are smart, they are innovative, they are knowledgeable, they are willing to take risks to change the world, and we want to encourage them to do so, because that's where progress comes from. So the Obama Foundation will be based in Chicago, but we're going to have projects and programs and digital networks all over the globe, and our international programming will focus on creating a space for all these young leaders from around the world to come together and start solving problems, both locally, nationally, and internationally. And I'm very much looking forward to working with organizations here in Brazil on this generational project, because I am convinced that the future is on our side as long as we give them, those young people, the chance to lead. There's not a challenge on the planet that they cannot solve, that our two nations together cannot solve. And I've got great faith that if we stand up for what's best in our values and our ideals, then we will carry on a very proud legacy into the future. So, muito obrigado. Thank you very much. And I think at this point I'll take some questions from Frederick. Thank you.
So, Mr. President, thank you so much. I'm sure our audience will arrive after this event at their offices or at their houses much more inspired, much more active citizens, as you mentioned, especially in this moment that we live in Brazil, perhaps the worst crisis in all aspects ever. So I would like to take benefit from among the points you mentioned, and start with globalization. So it is clear that after your mandate finished at the White House, globalization faced the backlash even faster. Inequality is rising, populism threatens democracies and institutions, immigration is soaring, a lot of problems with immigration, geopolitical tensions, as you mentioned, some of them here, are at the highest level in decades. What do you believe went wrong? What is going so wrong over the last year? And how do we fix that?
Yeah. Well, let me start by actually saying, Frederick, that although there are some difficult times that the world is going through, whenever I meet young people, I always say to them, if you had a choice of when to be born, and you could choose any time in human history, and you didn't know ahead of time who you were going to be, whether you were going to be a Brazilian or an American, whether you were going to be male or female, rich, poor, black, white, but you had to make a decision, you would choose now. Because for all the great challenges that we face, the world is wealthier, it is safer, it is better educated, it is more tolerant than any time in human history. Your chances of living a good life are better now than they were 20 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. And I say that oftentimes to young people just to give them some perspective, not to make us complacent, but to understand that human progress is possible. But as I said in my remarks, it doesn't always move in a straight line. Sometimes you go sideways, sometimes things move backwards before you go forward. I do think that we're at a moment where the shifts in technology, globalization, economic change, travel, migration have been moving much faster than our political institutions are able to absorb, and it's made people in countries around the world feel as if things are not in control. They're changing too fast. And human beings are, in some ways, inherently conservative. I don't mean conservative politically, I mean change is uncomfortable if things are too different and are happening too quickly. Now, the biggest change that's been taking place is economically. And in some ways, the changes have been really good for a lot of people. I mean, you think about China, for example. You have hundreds of millions of people who now are living so much better than their parents or their grandparents ever even imagined, in part because China's economy opened up. They joined the World Trade Organization. They became the manufacturing hub for the world. So that's a positive thing. We should think that is a good thing for humanity as a whole. On the other hand, though, it also meant that manufacturers in towns in the United States or perhaps in Brazil suddenly were confronted with competition that they'd never seen before. And although trade between the United States and China might have benefited many of us in the United States by bringing prices down, making manufacturing more efficient, what it also did is it devastated certain local communities in ways that have never recovered and made people feel as if the existing economic arrangements or trade arrangements were not good for them, and made it harder for them to imagine their children moving up the economic ladder, and in fact made them fearful that they might go down. So that's been happening in advanced economies all around the world. And if you imagine that that's going to accelerate over the next 10 years because of, for example, artificial intelligence, the power of data and digitalization to eliminate middle-class jobs, to eliminate office jobs, to eliminate basically any job that can be duplicated, including some jobs that traditionally have been viewed as extraordinarily skilled, like being a radiologist. There's possibilities with AI that those functions get replaced. That means that there's going to be more panic that somehow things are moving too fast. And all this creates a backlash and a reaction. And oftentimes that reaction is based on a very crude kind of nationalism or racial solidarity or xenophobia or anti-immigrant sentiment or conflicts between nations. And our goal has to be to do two things. One, to make sure that people feel as if in this new economy they can still succeed. They'll need new skills, which means that we have to invest in education. They'll need new social safety nets, like higher minimum wages, so that if they move into the service economy, they can still do as well as they used to when they were working on an assembly line. We will need to make sure that our pension systems are solvent and that health benefits, something I've been fighting in the United States for, that everybody has health insurance even if they lose their job or they have some bad luck. The more we can do those things to soften these transitions, the less appealing I think some of these damaging political trends are going to be. If we don't, then I think they will accelerate. And you know, the fact is that we know where that leads. You know, when you start getting countries or peoples saying we are better than somebody else, or that person over there is the reason for our problems, then that's when you get conflict. And if you start seeing that in the highly developed nations with the kinds of military firepower that they have, the results could be devastating.
You mentioned in your remarks about the low attendance in American polls, and this seems to be common in many countries. Still speaking about globalization and the politics side of all these challenges, we face, even here in Brazil, that established parties are losing the confidence from the people. I mean, politics has become people are not more involved in debating politics. They are tired of so many scandals. How do you see that is the most correct path to recover this, to engage people in politics, in votation?
Well, look, as I said before, democracy is never easy, and it can be frustrating, it can be slow. Politicians are human, which means they're flawed and they make mistakes. But I think that we know the recipe for how to create a healthy civic culture and healthy democracies. First of all, the principle of rule of law means that your political leaders work for you, not the other way around. And that means that you have checks and balances and systems to ensure that if politicians are enriching themselves at the expense of the people, if there's corruption, if there's favoritism that is not transparent for certain groups or certain people or certain businesses, that they have to be held accountable. And I think it is, if you look at the development paths so this is an economic issue as well as a political issue, countries that succeed, they have strong rule of law. And it doesn't mean that they have perfect politicians, but it does mean that they have a system that can check the flaws of politicians. And power is not concentrated too much just in one place. And I continue to believe that's true. I think the second thing that we have to recognize is that in order for politics to work, there has to be compromise. And I spoke about this a little bit earlier. One of the dangers that I'm seeing, at least in the United States, and it may be happening here in Brazil as well, is that we are losing a common framework, a common baseline of facts from which to then debate and argue about how we move forward. In the United States, it used to be there were 3 television stations. And so it didn't matter whether you were rich, poor, lived in a city or out on a farm, you were watching Walter Cronkite, and they would present to you what was happening in the world. And so people had at least some common way of thinking about problems, even if they didn't always agree. Today, in the United States, there's Fox News, and there's the New York Times, and if you were watching Fox News, your world is entirely different. What you see, what you believe, what you think, your facts, has no connection to what you would see in the New York Times. Now, I read the New York Times, so I'm a little biased. But what is true is if I watched Fox News, I wouldn't vote for me either. So, because I don't recognize myself. So, and in some ways, it's getting worse because of the internet. Right? So one of the phenomena, you read about the fake news that was being distributed in the United States during this past election. part of why it was so powerful is that somebody who already dislikes Hillary Clinton reads some rumor about her and then sends it out to their Facebook, on their Facebook page, and it gets picked up. And so no information is penetrating that network of people that would dispute what might be false. And so I think one of the challenges that we're going to have is to find ways in which to bring people together, not to agree on everything, but at least to agree on what is the problem. I'll take an example that I mentioned earlier, climate change. I don't mind if you want to have an argument with me that says, you know what, there's nothing we can do about the climate changing, we just have to adapt. Or, you want to say to me, the best way is market-based solutions and innovations, but we shouldn't have government regulation in order to deal with climate change because it would be too costly. I don't mind having that argument. But what I don't want to have is an argument where you say the planet's not getting warmer, because I have 99.9% of scientists who do this for a living saying the planet's getting warmer. So you don't argue with the facts, but if we can at least agree on the facts, then we can have a legitimate argument about how do we deal with this reality. And I think that we have to find better ways, both through media, but also in our communities, to establish that common framework. And then the last point I would make in terms of politics, I believe we have to get young people involved earlier in what is happening in their communities. I think politics suffers when you have the same people staying in power over and over and over again for many years, and there's never any new blood, and there's never any new ideas, and they get more and more entrenched. So people have asked me, for example, do you wish you were still president? And I say, first of all, if I was still president, Michelle might not be with me anymore. So I think like 8 years that's it. But also, even despite obviously strong disagreements with the person who replaced me, I do believe that if you're in power for too long, even with the best of intentions, that you become stale and your government becomes stale. And over time, you will not do what's best for the country, and the country will suffer. And so I see sometimes in the US Congress, people who've been there for 20, 30, 40 years. And because they're still there, they're blocking the 25 or the 30 or the 35-year-old who is more of their time and could be more innovative and creative in terms of solving the problems that we face today rather than the problems that we faced 35 years ago. And that's why I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can get young people involved at an early age in thinking about the world around them and getting them to recognize that the world doesn't have to be this way. It's this way because people made it this way, and you have the power to change it.
By the way, I'm quite happy to know that you're engaged with some young leaders in Brazil. I mean, definitely there's a challenge for us, the renewal of leaders in politics. And I'd like to shift to education and start by mentioning some quotes from a speech you did in Georgia a couple of years ago, in which says, so let's do what works and make sure none of our children start the race of life already behind. What message would you like to give to public and private leaders in Brazil regarding early childhood development and its challenges to make your quote a reality and to make, indeed, the renewal of our political leaders?
Well, I think that the first thing to understand is that in today's economy, countries will succeed or fail based on how well-trained their people are. If their people are good critical thinkers, if they have basic skills, if they can communicate effectively, if they can work as a team, then the country will be successful, even if it has no natural resources. And if it is not invested in its people, it doesn't matter how many natural resources it has, the country will do badly. And if you take a country like Singapore, it's landlocked. There's nothing there. It's a tiny little country. But its people are extraordinarily well educated. And as a consequence, the country thrives. I probably shouldn't name a country that has a lot of natural resources that's doing badly because it didn't invest in education, because I don't want to insult them, but we can all imagine countries around the world like that. And so, if I'm advising any nation, then their first job is to make sure that you are setting up an education system that is universal, that seeks to reach every child, and that is adapted to the realities of a highly evolving, rapidly evolving technological economy. And that starts very young. We know the science. If you work with a child from the poorest favela here in Brazil, but you reach them when they are 2 and 3, and you are giving them the basic knowledge they need, the building blocks for success, that investment will lead to them catching up to wealthier kids and lead them to continue to do well throughout their educational system. But for many poor kids, both in the United States and here in Brazil, they start off, even if they go to school, by the time they're 5 or 6, they've already lost so much because just simple things like, for example, they will have not heard as much vocabulary in those early years where their brain is a sponge. By the time they get to the first grade, they're already behind. So there are things that each country can do that are smart investments, and the younger you invest, the better the outcomes are going to be. I'll make one last point about this, which I think is important for all of us to keep in mind. You cannot succeed in today's economy if you are leaving half of your team off the field. So, countries that do not educate women and girls at the same pace as men, you will not succeed, because half your country is being left behind. If you are leaving people of African descent behind in that education process, you will not succeed over the long term, because that's talent that is being wasted. You wouldn't do that for your soccer team, right? You wouldn't say, well, we're going to have a really good training program for the lighter-skinned players and not so good of a program for the darker-skinned players, because you're not going to win the World Cup that way. Why we think differently when it comes to education, why we would think differently when it comes to our investments in our children, makes no sense. And it goes back to that kind of tribal thinking and some of the hierarchies that we've inherited in each of our countries. And it's time for us to get past them. Because if we don't, And getting past them, by the way, requires effort. It doesn't just naturally happen. Because the legacy of that history carries over generation after generation. And if you want to start solving that, then you've got to make bigger investments, and the investment in children is probably the best way to do it.
I mean, in the audience today, we have a lot of leaders from private sector, from politics, some politicians. But I would like to hear from you, facing so many challenges on education, climate, belief in politics, what do you think that is the role of civil society? I mean, how the leaders here from the private sector could boost the transformation we need?
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question, because I think in so many countries around the world, people say, I hate politicians, I hate politics, I hate government. But the truth is that our politics, our government, is a reflection of us. So if a society is healthy, if its civic institutions are healthy, then its politics will be healthy. And if the society is broken in some ways, then that will be reflected in its politics. And as a consequence, one of the things that I'm constantly encouraging is how do we get people involved in what's happening in their neighborhood or their workplace before government even gets involved. I think government is critical to solving big problems, like alleviation of poverty or setting up an education system. But nothing will change unless in a local community, people are meeting each other, they build trust with one another, and they learn to work together, and then that becomes reflected in how politics happens. And I think businesses have a big role to play. There are some businesses in the United States that are very good, what we call corporate citizens, and they actively encourage their employees to volunteer in their community and to contribute to charities and to go into the local school and mentor poor children and help to tutor them. And some companies take it a step further and say, for example, that we're going to reduce our energy usage so that we are part of the solution rather than the problem to climate change. Or we are going to make sure that on election day, our employees have the time to vote without being penalized, right? And there are things that businesses can do that are encouraging the kind of civic participation that I think is so important. Religious institutions can be a part of that. Local neighborhood clubs, sports, all those things build a sense of connection. And I think that one of the mistakes we make is that we think somehow politics is going to pull everybody together when on the ground everybody's living apart. Well, that's putting too big of a burden on politics. We have to make sure that we're creating a sense of community here on the ground level, in the neighborhood, in cities, in rural areas. And then, because people feel as if they know each other and they trust each other, then politics is going to work better. And each of us can play a role in that process. One of the things that we'll be doing when I go home as part of the early stages of our foundation, we will go into a city and we'll just take 100 young people, 15, 16, 18. We'll get them from different neighborhoods. We'll just have them sit together and say, what is it about your city that you'd like to change? And they might spend 2 hours working together, debating and thinking about how they could improve their city. And then we'll show them how they right now, at that age, could already start creating projects that would make a difference. And if we're training our young people to think that way, over time, our politics will get better.
Perfect. So let's talk a little bit about media. You mentioned your preferences. As you know, I mean, we live in a digital society, and digital is the way most of us get all the news. 60% of every new dollar spent on digital advertising goes to two companies, that they consider themselves technology companies. This concentration is unprecedented. And we have been seeing that one of the aspects of their growth is to give free access, especially in poor countries, to people to get online, to get access to the digital world. And you mentioned a couple of times already that social networks can misguide public opinion, and fake news, I mean, has become actually a challenge. How do you believe that this situation should be approached? Because it's a business situation as well. I mean, the concentration has no comparison with any other time in media history.
Well, a couple of points that I would make. Number one is every time a new information technology or media emerges, it takes some time for societies to absorb and process and understand the nature and the power of that technology and to harness it for the good. That's true with the printing press, that is true with radio, that is true with television. It also creates some dangers every time there's a new information technology, because at each phase, ideas are magnified and sent into the world much more powerfully than they were before. That can be true for good ideas, but it can also be true for very bad and destructive ideas. And we're going through, I think, one of those times now. The second point is that concentration of media is actually not unique to today. In the United States, for example, as I mentioned earlier, it used to be there were just 3 television stations. Now, there was a rough agreement among the ruling elites who managed those stations about what was appropriate and how to conduct business, and there were some laws in place in the United States that ensured that if one point of view was presented, then the other point of view was presented. But it was still a very closed system because essentially they were exercising monopoly power. So the problem of concentration of media power is not unique to today. And then the third point I would make is that many of these systems are extremely powerful, but they're not inherently conservative or liberal. They're neutral in that sense. And the problem that I see emerging is not the platforms in and of themselves, but the way in which the platforms operate to accelerate the kind of splintering of information that we discussed earlier, right? The siloing effect that happens. And I don't have like a one silver bullet, one perfect answer that will solve this problem. I do think that what won't work, or what would be more dangerous, is if the government started censoring or restricting or determining what information was flowing over the internet. I think that is the wrong direction to go in, precisely because then if you combine the power of the state and its military power and its police power with also its information power, then you have the makings of tyranny over time and the loss of freedom for individuals and the loss of truth eventually because ideas aren't able to compete in the marketplace. So I don't think censorship's the answer, but I do think that it is entirely legitimate to try to encourage competition in the media space. And whether the old antitrust rules that existed in some countries like the United States are the right approach, or whether there are new rules that have to be formed to ensure that these spaces remain open for new technologies, new information, that's something that I think will have to be determined. I also think that it's going to be important to make sure that online communities that are formed move offline. And what I mean by that is, I always tell my daughters, for example, they're on their phones all the time, and they're texting. I say, why don't you go meet with your friends? And go talk to them face to face. Because the experience of being with people is different than being with a text. And I think that what's true for my daughters is true for adults, it's true for communities, it's true for people. Trying to find ways in which we're not trapped by this media all the time, but rather continue to participate in communal events and activities and discussions, I think is going to be very important as well. But one of the things that I'm going to do with our foundation is try to set up a laboratory where we can test ideas about how do we break down some of the isolating tendencies of this new media. How do we encourage more critical thinking about what people are reading on the internet, and how do we bring people with different viewpoints together in not just insults between each other, but in an actual dialogue. I think we're going to have to try a lot of different things to see what ends up solving some of the problems that you're discussing.
You just spoke about your foundation. One question, I mean, you decided to focus on the micro level in your foundation instead of a more macro community approach. Why that?
Well, here's what I learned as President of the United States, which is a pretty, it gives you a good seat to see how things happen around the world. You get a good viewpoint. Most of the problems that we have, whether it's in the United States, in Brazil, in Nigeria, in Vietnam, Germany, wherever, most of the time the problem is not because we don't know technically what to do, that we don't have a technical solution for a problem. Usually the problem we face is because our politics, our social arrangements, our interactions prevent us from implementing what needs to be done. You know, I can tell you right now ways in which we could increase agricultural yields in sub-Saharan Africa 4 times and feed the entire country, every country there. The reason is not because we don't have the right seed, or we don't have the right technology, or the right tools, or the right methods. The reason is because it's very hard to plant if people are shooting each other. You know, on a problem as big as climate change, it's true that for us to entirely solve the problem, we will have to invent cheaper, more effective, low carbon or zero carbon emission energy sources. But even with the energy technologies that we have today, we could, right now, today, eliminate probably 30% of greenhouse emissions or 35% of greenhouse emissions without having any impact on our standards of living or our economic progress or development. The reason we don't do it is because our politics block it, or public opinion doesn't know what a significant threat climate change may be. I say all this because what I've determined is that the best thing I can do, and I'll work on individual issues and lend my voice to efforts to solve many of the problems that are out there today. But the thing that I can probably do that will have the most lasting effect is if, instead of just me doing it, I'm training 1,000, and then 10,000, and then 100,000, then 1 million young people around the world who are able to give voice to problems, are able to work together across barriers of race or language or nationality, who are able to use media in positive ways, who are able to organize their communities and get people involved. If I'm doing that, then I'm confident we'll be able to find solutions to any of the problems out here. If we don't do that, then we're going to have problems. So, and the way to train young people and get them involved as leaders is typically at the local level. It's not starting here, but it's starting in a neighborhood or in a city or in a community and getting them involved that way.
Unfortunately, we are arriving at the last question. Unfortunately for us, we would like to have you for the whole day, for sure. Self-criticism and self-evaluation are crucial to any person, project, or company. Can you give us an example of something that your administration has accomplished and you're especially proud of? And also an example of something that you often regret or that you believe that could have been done better?
Well, you know, there are many things that we accomplished that I'm proud of. I think in the United States, domestically, the most satisfaction came from passing healthcare reform in the United States, because that was 20 million people who had healthcare that didn't have it before. And I'd get letters from families who said, you know, my child was sick, and if it hadn't been for that law, he might have died. And for you to know that you've had that impact on so many people's lives directly is powerful. And even though it continues to generate controversy in the United States, even though it's worked as it was supposed to, and none of the predictions of disaster that my friends on the other side of the political divide predicted, you know, just knowing that typically once you're able to get a program that delivers social progress, even if it's not everything you want, even if it's not perfect, that usually it becomes the foundation to build a more lasting change. You know, that makes me feel very good. Internationally, I'm very proud of the work we did on the Iran nuclear deal. You know, when I came into office, and the part of the reason this is timely is because, frankly, when I came into office, it was too late with North Korea in some sense. They already had nuclear weapons and a built-up nuclear infrastructure. In Iran, a country with whom the United States has great differences, and frankly, a country that has oftentimes exported problems to other parts of the region and around the world. So you know, Iran's the Iranian government is not a consistent friend and oftentimes is an adversary to us. Nevertheless, I thought here was an opportunity for us to solve a narrow problem, which is making sure that they did not develop nuclear weapons. And if we applied enough economic pressure, but also gave them an inducement to negotiate, that maybe this is a problem we could solve without resort to military force. And it took 6, 7 years of work. But we were successful. And as a consequence, Iran is not going down the path that North Korea did. We still have enormous differences with Iran and tensions between our nations, but that particular problem was solved without firing a shot. And it speaks to the possibilities of strong diplomacy, even with some of your strongest adversaries, if you are persistent. And in terms of regrets, oh, the list is long. I always joke, I regret I didn't start dyeing my hair. You know, now it's too late. You know, you know, I think that my biggest regret is not being able to bridge the differences that were emerging in our politics as much as I wanted. And part of that was I came into office during a very bad economic crisis. And people were scared. And although we responded very successfully and avoided what could have been a Great Depression, not just a deep recession, it happened slowly enough that people got frustrated and people went to their two different corners. And the anger in our politics, rather than me being able to pull it out, seemed to increase. I like to think that I didn't contribute to it. You know, I tend to be a very calm guy. You don't hear me yelling a lot, at least not in public. But I think it's fair to say that when I left office, the hope that I had of bringing people together across our differences, that I hadn't succeeded. But the good news is that it's not just presidents who can contribute to that work. We can all contribute to that work. Ex-presidents can contribute to that work. So, you know, hopefully I have another 20 years, 30 years, you know, to keep at it. See if we can bring that message of hope not only among peoples within the United States, but within the Americas and ultimately around the world. So,
I'm sure you are contributing. Okay. Thank you very much once again. Look forward to having you in Brazil soon. Thank you.
Thank you.